The headlamp beam cut through absolute darkness as the prospector squeezed through a passage that had been sealed for generations. What he found embedded in the rock wall would rewrite everything the town of Silver Peak thought it knew about its own history. The safe had been waiting there for over a century, and the secrets locked inside would finally explain why 3 men vanished on the same winter night in 1924, why the richest mine in the territory suddenly closed without explanation, and why certain families in town had been searching these tunnels for 100 years. Marcus Webb had spent 18 months exploring the abandoned network of mines that honeycombed the mountains above Silver Peak, Colorado. The town itself had dwindled from a population of 12,000 during the gold rush to barely 800 permanent residents who remained mostly because their families had always been there. The glory days had ended decades before Marcus was born, but something about the mountains called to him the way they had called to prospectors for over a century and a half. He worked alone, methodically documenting old shafts, testing rock samples, and occasionally finding enough color to keep his operation viable. But he had never expected to find anything like this. The tunnel Marcus discovered that October morning had been deliberately concealed. While exploring a section of the old Monarch mine that had been closed since the 1920s, he noticed irregularities in what appeared to be a natural collapse. The rock fall looked wrong somehow, too uniform, too carefully arranged. It took him 3 days of careful excavation to confirm his suspicion. Someone had staged this collapse, had wanted this particular tunnel to stay hidden and forgotten. Behind the false wall of stones and timber, a passage stretched into darkness, untouched and unexplored for what his geological training told him was approximately 100 years. Marcus proceeded with extreme caution. Old mines were death traps under the best circumstances, and this tunnel showed signs of instability that made every step potentially his last. The timber supports had rotted in places, and the ceiling bore ominous cracks that spoke of enormous pressure from the mountain above. But something drove him forward, a prospector's instinct that whispered promises of discovery. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, taking him far deeper than the main workings of the Monarch mine had ever reached. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to dig this passage and even more extraordinary lengths to hide it afterward. The safe appeared suddenly in his headlamp beam, so unexpected that Marcus initially thought he was hallucinating from the bad air. It stood nearly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, a massive iron construct that must have weighed close to 1,000 pounds. But what truly astonished him was its location. The safe had been built directly into the tunnel wall, incorporated into the rock itself as if the entire passage had been excavated specifically to house this one object. The iron showed extensive rust and mineral deposits from a century of seepage, but the craftsmanship remained evident. This had been an expensive, custom-made piece, designed to be absolutely impregnable. Marcus spent an hour examining the safe without touching it, documenting everything with his camera and trying to understand what he was seeing. The combination dial was still intact, though it had seized with rust. The door bore a manufacturer's mark he recognized from his research into mining history. Kellington Security Company of Denver, a firm that had specialized in safes for banks and mines during the gold rush era but had gone out of business before the Great Depression. 3 heavy bolts secured the door, each as thick as his wrist. But most intriguingly, someone had attempted to open this safe using explosives. Scorch marks and blast damage scarred the rock around it, though the safe itself had withstood the assault. Someone had tried very hard to get inside and had failed. The decision to open the safe required careful consideration. Marcus understood that what he had found represented significant historical value regardless of its contents. The proper procedure would involve notifying the authorities, bringing in historians and preservation experts, documenting everything through official channels. But Marcus also understood small-town politics and the realities of mining law. If word got out about this discovery before he understood what it meant, he would lose control of the find completely. Claim jumpers, both legal and illegal, would descend on this site within days. So he made the choice that prospectors had been making in these mountains for generations. He would open the safe himself, see what it contained, and then decide how to proceed. Getting the safe open took another 2 days of careful work. Marcus returned to the surface only to gather supplies and equipment, telling no one about his discovery. He brought down cutting tools, lubricants, and a small hydraulic jack. The combination mechanism had fused solid with rust and time, making it impossible to open through normal means. But the hinges represented a potential weakness. Marcus worked methodically, applying penetrating oil, using heat from a small torch to expand the metal, and gradually working the hydraulic jack into position to force the door against its bolts. The moment the safe finally yielded came with a sound like a gunshot that echoed through the tunnel and sent Marcus's heart racing with thoughts of cave-ins. But the ceiling held, and the door swung slowly open on hinges that shrieked in protest. The smell that emerged was strange and musty, the scent of sealed air that had been trapped for a century. Marcus directed his headlamp into the interior and froze in complete astonishment at what the light revealed. The safe contained no gold, or samples, no bags of coins or certificates of deposit. Instead, it held papers. Hundreds and hundreds of papers, all carefully organized in leather portfolios that had survived the decades remarkably well due to the dry air within the sealed safe. But these were not ordinary documents. Marcus carefully extracted the first portfolio and opened it with trembling hands. Inside, he found what appeared to be personal journals, maps, and official-looking documents with seals and signatures. The handwriting was old-fashioned but clear, and as Marcus began to read by the light of his headlamp, he realized that he held in his hands the complete explanation for one of Silver Peak's oldest and most debated mysteries. Before Marcus could truly appreciate what he had found, he needed to understand the history. Growing up in Silver Peak, he had heard the stories many times, though they had always been presented as legend rather than fact. In the winter of 1924, 3 men had vanished from town on the same night: Thomas Hendricks, the mine superintendent of the Monarch, James Voss, the town banker, and Clayton Merrick, who served as both the company bookkeeper and the unofficial historian of the mining district. No bodies were ever found, no explanation ever emerged, and no trace of the men ever surfaced despite intensive searches that continued for months. The official conclusion had been that they perished somewhere in the mountains during an unexpected blizzard that struck that night, though their bodies were never recovered and their reasons for being out in such weather remained unexplained. The disappearance had come at a pivotal moment in Silver Peak's history. The Monarch mine, which had been the richest producer in the entire region, closed permanently within weeks of the vanishings. The official explanation cited depleted ore bodies and unsustainable operating costs, but rumors had circulated for decades suggesting darker reasons. Some townspeople whispered about embezzlement and fraud. Others insisted that the 3 men had stolen a fortune and fled to Mexico. Still others maintained that they had been murdered by claim jumpers or rival mine operators. Over the decades, the story had become part of local folklore, embellished and debated but never resolved. Now Marcus held the truth in his hands, and it was far stranger and more complex than any of the theories that had circulated through the years. The journals belonged to Clayton Merrick, and they told a story of discovery, conspiracy, and desperate choices made in the face of impossible circumstances. Marcus settled onto the tunnel floor with his back against the rock wall and began to read, occasionally pausing to examine maps and documents that provided context for the narrative emerging from the pages. The story began 2 years before the disappearances, in 1922, when Clayton Merrick made a discovery while conducting a routine audit of the Monarch mine's operations. The mine had been in operation for nearly 40 years at that point, and its network of tunnels and shafts extended for miles through the mountain. But Merrick found discrepancies in the maps, areas where the official surveys did not match the actual excavations. Someone had been conducting unauthorized mining operations, digging tunnels that did not appear in any official documentation and removing or that never appeared in the company's production records. Merrick brought his concerns to Thomas Hendricks, who as mine superintendent had authority over all operations. Together, they began a secret investigation, using their off hours to explore the hidden workings and trace the unauthorized excavations back to their source. What they discovered shocked them both. The illegal mining had been conducted by a group of the mine's own employees, organized and protected by James Voss, the town banker who also sat on the mine company's board of directors. Voss had been systematically stealing from the mine for years, using his position to conceal the theft and his banking connections to launder the proceeds. But that discovery, shocking as it was, represented only the beginning of the story. As Hendricks and Merrick explored the unauthorized tunnels, they stumbled onto something far more significant. The illegal excavations had broken through into a previously unknown section of the mountain, a massive chamber that contained mineral formations unlike anything either man had ever seen. The walls glittered with what appeared to be gold, but chemical analysis revealed something extraordinary. The gold existed in a form they could not identify, mixed with unknown compounds that seemed to have unusual properties. Samples sent discreetly to laboratories in Denver and San Francisco came back with results that bordered on the impossible. The chamber contained an estimated $30 million worth of gold at 1922 prices, an absolutely staggering amount. But the gold's unusual composition made it potentially far more valuable to industrial and scientific interests. The two men realized they had discovered something that could make fortunes or start wars, and they had no idea how to proceed. Making the discovery public would expose Voss's theft but would also trigger a claim rush that would tear the town apart. Keeping it secret meant becoming criminals themselves. They decided to document everything thoroughly while they figured out the right course of action. Over the next 18 months, the three men, Hendricks, Merrick, and eventually Voss, who they confronted with evidence of his crimes, developed an increasingly complex relationship. Voss argued that the discovery belonged to whoever could properly exploit it, not to the mine company that had failed to find it first. Hendricks maintained that ethics and law demanded they report everything immediately. Merrick, as he recorded in his journals, found himself torn between these opposing positions, recognizing validity in both arguments while understanding that any choice they made would have enormous consequences. The situation became critical in late 1924 when Voss informed the others that he had learned through his banking contacts that the mine company was planning to sell the Monarch operation to a larger firm. The sale would include comprehensive new surveys that would certainly discover the hidden chamber. They had weeks at most before their secret became public knowledge. Voss pushed hard for them to extract as much gold as possible before the sale went through. Hendricks refused categorically. Merrick, according to his journal entries, spent sleepless nights trying to find a solution that would not destroy lives and careers. The journals painted a picture of Merrick as a thoughtful man caught in an impossible situation. He documented everything with meticulous care, recording conversations, copying documents, and creating detailed maps of all the workings both authorized and unauthorized. He seemed to recognize that whatever happened, a complete record needed to exist. His entries revealed his growing certainty that there was no good solution, that any path forward would end in tragedy for some or all of them. The final entries in Merrick's journal came in early December 1924, just days before the disappearances. He wrote about a final confrontation between the three men in which Voss revealed that he had already moved substantial amounts of gold out of the chamber and had hidden it in preparation for his eventual departure. Hendricks threatened to go to the authorities immediately. Merrick recorded his own despair at seeing two men he respected tearing each other apart over decisions that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The last entry, dated December 8, 1924, contained a single sentence that made Marcus's blood run cold as he read it by lantern light 100 years later. "Tonight we will end this, one way or another." But the journals did not end there. Marcus found additional documents that filled in what happened on that final night. They took the form of official statements, signed and sealed, that the three men had prepared together. The documents explained that they had decided on a desperate solution. They would hide all evidence of the discovery, seal the chamber to make it inaccessible, and disappear from Silver Peak permanently. They would become the mystery rather than expose the truth, because the truth would destroy too many innocent people. The mine company would collapse if the theft became public. Dozens of families who had invested their savings based on Voss's banking advice would be ruined. The entire town's economy would implode. The three men made a pact. They would fake their deaths in a way that would appear to be a tragic accident, leaving no bodies to be found. They would seal away all evidence of the hidden chamber and the unauthorized mining operations. They would create this safe, hidden in a tunnel they would then collapse and conceal, containing the complete record of everything that had happened. And then they would leave Silver Peak forever, traveling separately to new lives far from Colorado. The documents included copies of the letters they had prepared for their families, letters that would never be sent but that expressed their love and their reasons for making the choice they had made. Marcus found maps showing the location of the hidden chamber and detailed instructions for accessing it. He found chemical analyses of the unusual gold compound. He found financial records documenting every ounce that Voss had stolen and where he had hidden portions of it before their departure. He found personal effects, a pocket watch that must have belonged to one of the men, photographs of families, a child's drawing carefully preserved in waxed paper. And he found one final document, a message addressed to whoever might eventually find the safe, explaining their hope that enough time would pass before discovery that the truth would no longer matter to anyone, that it would become simply history rather than a live wound. Sitting in the tunnel with these documents spread around him, Marcus understood the full weight of what he held. He had not found treasure in the conventional sense. He had found the truth about three men who had made an extraordinary choice, sacrificing their own identities and their futures with their families to protect a town from knowledge that would have destroyed it. They had become the mystery rather than reveal the mystery. They had chosen to be remembered as cautionary tales about the dangers of greed and the harshness of the mountains rather than as the complex, conflicted men they actually were. But Marcus also recognized something else. The hidden chamber still existed somewhere in this mountain. The maps showed its location relative to landmarks he could identify. The gold might still be there, waiting. Voss's hidden caches might still be recoverable. The extraordinary mineral compound that had so fascinated the laboratories in 1922 might represent something of immense value even by modern standards. The safe contained not just history but potentially a fortune that dwarfed anything Marcus had ever dreamed of finding. He spent the next week carefully photographing and documenting everything in the safe before removing any items from the tunnel. He worked alone, telling no one, while he wrestled with his own version of the dilemma that had confronted Hendricks, Voss, and Merrick a century earlier. The easy choice would be to announce the discovery, let historians and lawyers and mining companies sort it out, and hope for some finder's fee or reward. But Marcus had spent enough time in the mountains to understand that such an announcement would trigger chaos. Claim disputes would erupt immediately. Every descendant of every person who had ever worked in the Monarch mine would lawyer up and demand a piece of whatever was found. The town would tear itself apart, just as the three men had feared it would in 1924. The responsible choice would be to honor the sacrifice the three men had made and reseal the safe, let the mystery remain a mystery. But Marcus found that choice almost impossible to accept. The truth mattered. History deserved to be corrected. And yes, if he was honest with himself, the prospect of the fortune that might still be waiting in that hidden chamber made his heart race with the same fever that had driven prospectors in these mountains for generations. Marcus made his decision on the 8th day after opening the safe. He would do what Clayton Merrick had done. He would document everything thoroughly and create a complete record, but he would not make it public immediately. He would spend whatever time it took to verify the maps, locate the hidden chamber if it still existed, and understand exactly what he had found before deciding how to proceed. He owed that much to his own future and to the memory of three men who had valued careful thought over impulsive action. Finding the chamber took longer than Marcus anticipated. The maps were detailed but a century old, and the mountain had shifted in the decades since they were drawn. Tunnels had collapsed, new fissures had opened, and the landmarks the maps referenced had sometimes ceased to exist. Marcus worked systematically, spending 10 to 12 hours underground each day, following the maps while accommodating the changes time had wrought in the geology. He told people in town that he was pursuing a promising lead in the old workings, which was technically true, and deflected questions about specifics with the practiced evasiveness of prospectors everywhere. He found the chamber on a cold morning in late November, exactly 1 month after discovering the safe. The entrance was where the maps indicated it should be, though it had been filled with rubble in what must have been the final act of Hendricks, Voss, and Marek before their departure. Marcus spent 2 days carefully excavating the passage, moving rock and debris with the constant fear that any mistake might trigger a collapse that would bury him and the discovery together. But finally, he squeezed through the opening and directed his headlamp into the chamber beyond, and what he saw exceeded every description in the journals. The chamber was enormous, roughly 50 feet in diameter and 30 feet high, a natural cavity in the mountain that had somehow remained stable for millions of years. But what took Marcus's breath away was the walls. They glittered and gleamed in his light, covered with mineral formations that looked like frozen golden waterfalls. The gold existed in veins and nodules and crystalline structures unlike anything Marcus had seen in 18 months of prospecting. It was beautiful and alien and obviously valuable beyond calculation. He stood in the center of that chamber and understood viscerally why 3 men had been willing to sacrifice everything to keep this place secret. Marcus spent hours examining the chamber before beginning to take samples. The gold appeared to be naturally alloyed with other elements he could not immediately identify, creating colors that ranged from the familiar yellow to strange greenish and bluish tints. He carefully documented everything with photographs and video, knowing that regardless of what happened next, this record would be crucial. He took samples from different areas of the chamber, marking their locations precisely on his copies of the old maps. And then he sat in the center of that glittering space and tried to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The practical considerations were significant. Even if he could legally claim the discovery, extracting the gold would require equipment and expertise far beyond his resources. He would need partners, investors, lawyers, and permission from multiple governmental agencies. The process could take years and might ultimately result in him losing control of the discovery entirely. But the alternative, keeping it secret, trying to extract material gradually and quietly, would make him exactly the kind of criminal that Voss had been, the kind that Hendricks and Marek had sacrificed everything to avoid becoming. Marcus made his decision during the long climb back to the surface that evening. He would reveal the discovery, but he would do it right. He would approach the Historical Society first, provide them with the journals and documents from the safe, let them begin the process of correcting the historical record about the 3 missing men. Then he would work through proper channels to document and claim the chamber, accepting whatever outcome resulted from following legal and ethical procedures. He would not let the prospect of wealth turn him into the kind of person who valued fortune over integrity. The next morning, Marcus drove into town and requested a meeting with Ellen Kincaid, who had served as president of the Silver Peak Historical Society for over 20 years. He arrived at her house at the appointed time carrying a weathered leather portfolio that had spent a century in a hidden safe, and began to tell her a story that would finally answer questions her organization had been debating since before she was born. Ellen's reaction combined shock, fascination, and growing excitement as Marcus laid out the evidence piece by piece. She handled the journals with trembling hands, reading passages aloud as tears ran down her face. She examined the photographs and the personal effects, laying them out on her dining room table like precious relics. And when Marcus finally told her about the chamber, showed her the maps and the samples, she sat back in her chair and laughed with something that sounded like both joy and disbelief. The story broke publicly 3 days later, after Ellen had time to verify key elements of Marcus's account through her own research. The Historical Society held a press conference that drew reporters from Denver, Aspen, and even a few national outlets that were intrigued by the century-old mystery and its unexpected solution. Marcus found himself uncomfortable with the attention but recognized its necessity. The discovery was too significant to handle quietly, and transparency from the beginning might help avoid some of the legal complications that would inevitably follow. The reaction in Silver Peak itself was complex and emotional. Descendants of the 3 missing men gathered at the Historical Society to read the journals and letters. Some expressed relief at finally knowing the truth. Others struggled with the revelation that their ancestors had not died heroic deaths in the mountains, but had instead made the calculated choice to abandon their families. Public opinion in town split between those who viewed Hendricks, Voss, and Merrick as noble men who had sacrificed everything to protect their community, and those who saw them as cowards and criminals who had caused untold pain to their families by choosing disappearance over honesty. The legal situation proved as complicated as Marcus had anticipated. Multiple parties claimed interest in both the historical artifacts and the mineral rights to the chamber. The mine company that had purchased the Monarch operation in 1925 had long since gone bankrupt, but its successor companies argued that they held rights to any discoveries within the original claim boundaries. The federal government asserted authority over the historical artifacts as archaeological materials. Descendants of the three missing men filed suits claiming ownership of the journals and personal effects. And Marcus himself filed the necessary claims to establish his rights as the discoverer of both the safe and the chamber. The legal wrangling took over a year to resolve and ended with a compromise that satisfied no one completely but allowed everyone to feel they had gained something. The journals, documents, and personal effects were declared property of the Historical Society to be preserved and displayed for the public benefit. Marcus was awarded a finder's fee and a percentage of any future proceeds from the chamber, contingent on proper development following all environmental and mining regulations. The remaining value was split between various government agencies, the town of Silver Peak, and a trust established for descendants of the three men. No one got rich quickly, but no one walked away empty-handed. The hidden chamber itself became the subject of extensive study before any mining operations could commence. Geologists, mineralogists, and material scientists descended on Silver Peak to examine the unusual gold compound. Early analysis suggested that the material had potential applications in advanced electronics and aerospace engineering, making it potentially more valuable for its properties than for its gold content alone. The research process moved slowly, hampered by the difficulty of accessing the chamber and the fragility of the mountain geology. Marcus participated in the studies, providing his expertise in the local geology and the history of the workings, gradually transitioning from solo prospector to technical consultant. The three men themselves remained enigmatic figures even after the truth emerged. Despite extensive research, no one ever found definitive evidence of what had become of Thomas Hendricks, James Voss, and Clayton Merrick after they left Silver Peak in December 1924. Researchers found tantalizing hints: a Thomas Hendricks who had worked as a mining engineer in Peru in the 1930s, a James Voss who appeared in banking records in Toronto around the same time, S.C. Merrick who had published articles on Western history in small journals in the 1940s. But none of these leads resulted in confirmation. The three men had succeeded in their goal of disappearing completely, becoming new people somewhere far from the mountains that had defined their original lives. Marcus found himself thinking often about the choice they had made and comparing it to his own decisions. They had valued their community over their own comfort, had chosen to become a cautionary tale rather than expose truths that would have caused suffering. Whether that choice was right remained debatable, but its sincerity was undeniable. They had not stolen the gold for themselves, had not enriched themselves at others' expense. They had walked away from everything, sacrificing their identities and their futures out of a sense of responsibility that seemed almost incomprehensible by modern standards. The discovery changed Marcus's life in ways he had not anticipated. The finder's fee and his consulting work provided financial security he had never expected to achieve from prospecting. But more significantly, the experience changed how he understood his relationship to the mountains and to the history that permeated every tunnel and shaft. He began working more closely with the Historical Society, using his knowledge of mining and geology to help interpret and preserve other historical sites. He gave talks at schools and conferences about the discovery and its implications. He became, somewhat to his own surprise, a kind of custodian of the story, ensuring that the tale of Hendricks, Voss, and Merrick was told accurately and completely. The town of Silver Peak experienced its own transformation. The publicity surrounding the discovery brought tourists who wanted to see where history had been hidden for so long. The Historical Society developed tours of the Monarch Mine's safe sections, telling the story of the three men and the impossible choice they had faced. A permanent exhibition displayed the journals and documents, allowing visitors to read Clayton Merrick's words in his own handwriting. The town's economy, which had been declining steadily for decades, found new life in heritage tourism and the ongoing research into the unusual gold compound. 5 years after his initial discovery, Marcus stood in the renovated Historical Society building for the unveiling of a new monument. The town had commissioned a sculptor to create a memorial to Hendricks, Voss, and Merrick, to be placed in the main square where a generic mining memorial had stood for decades. The new sculpture depicted 3 figures looking out toward the mountains, their faces deliberately left indistinct because no one knew exactly what they had looked like in their final days in Silver Peak. The inscription simply stated their names, their dates in the town, and the words, "They chose to become the mystery to preserve the community." Marcus had been asked to speak at the dedication ceremony. He stood before the assembled townspeople and visitors and talked about what it meant to discover something that had been deliberately hidden, about the responsibility that came with bringing secrets to light, and about the complex courage required to make choices that ensured one would be misunderstood for generations. He spoke about the safe that had waited in darkness for a century, protecting its secrets until someone came along who was patient enough and careful enough to open it without destroying what lay inside. And he spoke about the ongoing mystery of what had become of the 3 men after they walked away from everything they knew, suggesting that perhaps that final secret should remain inviolate, their one remaining privacy after their sacrifice had been exposed to the world. After the ceremony, Marcus returned to the mountains as he did most days. He no longer prospected in the old way, no longer searched for his own fortune in the rock. Instead, he explored with different eyes, looking for stories as much as for gold, understanding that the real treasures in these mountains were often not the ones that glittered but the ones that revealed something true about the people who had come before. He thought about the safe he had found, about the moment when it had finally opened and released its secrets into a world that had forgotten they existed. And he thought about his own choice to handle that discovery with care rather than with greed, and how that single decision had defined everything that came after. The chamber remained sealed pending the completion of the scientific studies and the development of a comprehensive mining plan that would protect the mountain's stability while allowing access to the unique materials within. Marcus had accepted that he might never see the chamber fully exploited in his lifetime, that the process of doing things properly and safely might take decades. But he found he was at peace with that timeline. The chamber had waited 100 years after its discovery by Hendricks, Voss, and Merrick. It had waited millions of years before that. It could wait a while longer. Sometimes Marcus wondered what would have happened if he had never found that false collapse in the tunnel, if he had walked past it the way countless others must have over the decades. The story would have remained hidden, the mystery unsolved, and 3 men would have continued to exist only as cautionary figures in local folklore. But he had found it, had made the choices he made, and in doing so had changed the narrative not just of those 3 men but of the entire town and everyone connected to it. The weight of that responsibility never fully left him, but neither did the satisfaction of knowing he had handled it honorably. On quiet evenings, Marcus sometimes returned to the tunnel where the safe still stood, now secured and protected as a historical site but still accessible to him as the discoverer. He would sit beside it in the darkness, his headlamp switched off, listening to the deep silence of the mountain. And he would think about Clayton Merrick sitting in this same place 100 years earlier, carefully arranging documents in leather portfolios, creating the record that would eventually reveal the truth. 2 men separated by a century, connected by a choice to preserve something important, to ensure that stories did not vanish completely into darkness and time. The gold in the chamber and the value of the unusual compound had generated significant interest and promised future wealth for the town and for Marcus himself. But that had never been the real treasure, Marcus came to understand. The real treasure was the story itself, the revelation of the complexity of human choice, the documentation of how 3 men had struggled with impossible circumstances and had made a decision that cost them everything while protecting others. That story had value that transcended any mineral wealth, and its discovery and preservation represented something more important than any fortune. Years after his discovery, Marcus received a letter forwarded through the Historical Society from someone claiming to be a grandson of Thomas Hendricks. The writer explained that his grandfather had lived until 1967 under a different name in Argentina, had married and raised a family there, and had left behind his own journal that documented his life after leaving Silver Peak. The family had only recently learned about the discovery in Colorado and wanted to contribute their grandfather's account to the historical record. Marcus helped facilitate the donation of those materials to the Historical Society, and they added new dimensions to the story, confirming some elements of Clayton Merrick's account while providing fresh perspective on the three men's motivations and their lives after their departure. Similar contacts followed over the next few years as descendants of the other two men emerged with their own materials and memories. The story continued to expand and evolve, becoming richer and more nuanced with each edition. The three men who had tried so hard to disappear completely found themselves returned to history more fully than they could have imagined, their humanity restored, their complex motivations understood and debated and ultimately appreciated by people who would never have known about them if Marcus had not found that sealed safe in a hidden tunnel. The discovery that had begun with a prospector's instinct and a falsely collapsed tunnel had opened into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. It had solved a mystery, corrected history, brought a community together, and revealed the depth of sacrifice that people were capable of making. And it had taught Marcus that the most valuable discoveries were not always the ones that made you rich, but the ones that made you understand something true about the world and the people in it, the ones that connected you to the long chain of human stories that stretched back through time and would continue forward into a future he would never see. As Marcus grew older, he spent more time documenting his own story, creating a record of how he had found the safe, the choices he had made, and the reasons behind those choices. He wrote it all down in careful detail, including his doubts and uncertainties, his temptations and his moments of clarity. He did it because he had learned from Clayton Merrick the importance of leaving a clear record, of not allowing future generations to have to guess at motivations or fill in blanks with speculation. He did it because he understood now that he was part of the story, that his discovery and his choices had become woven into the larger narrative of Silver Peak and the three men who had tried to vanish into history. The sealed safe had held secrets for 100 years, and its opening had changed everything while ultimately confirming what thoughtful people had always suspected, that the truth was more complex than legend, that real people faced real dilemmas without easy answers, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in bold action but in quiet sacrifice made with full knowledge of its cost. That was the real treasure Marcus had found in the darkness beneath the mountain, and it was worth more than all the gold that glittered in that hidden chamber, worth more than any fortune he might have claimed for himself. He had found the truth, and in choosing to bring it to light carefully and honorably, he had become worthy of the discovery he had made. The story of the sealed safe and the three vanished men became part of Silver Peak's identity in a new way, transformed from cautionary tale to testament of the complicated courage required to live with integrity in impossible circumstances. And Marcus Webb, the prospector who had squeezed through a false collapse in search of gold, found that the greatest treasure he ever discovered was the opportunity to reveal truth and preserve history, ensuring that three men who had chosen to disappear would finally be remembered for who they truly were rather than for the mystery they had become. The safe had been sealed for a century, but now it stood open, and the light that poured from it illuminated not just the past but the present and future of everyone it touched.